So pretty much everyone that has used React before, at least in like a server environment, has seen like one of those errors before, where like you nest your like p tags and that's not valid HTML, so like it gets thrown away. And then like React doesn't know how to hydrate it, and then the error that you get is like hydration failed because p tag, basically that kind of thing. And it was just like really hard for people to understand like where is this thing actually coming from. And at this point, we now have like a diff view of that, which basically showed you exactly the line that was changing. And one of those examples is like if you do a new date and you just render that and you hydrate it on the client, the date is now different, obviously. But that now is highlighted as well. So there's like a diff view that just says like plus, minus, and then like this is a change.
Tim Neutkens joins us to talk about the state of Next.js with additional insights on Vercel, TurboPack, Webpack, and more.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet or on LinkedIn at Tracy S. Lee. And I'm joined by my co-host, Adam Rakis. Hello, Adam.
Hello.
You can find Adam on Twitter at Adam Rakis. And Tim is joining us today as well. Hello, Tim.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, so excited to have you. And Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself and also where we can find you.
Yeah, I'm Tim Neutkens on Twitter, GitHub, anywhere else really. I work at Vercel on Next.js. Have been at Vercel for almost 7 years now, and most of it working on Next.js. So if you've ever been on GitHub on the Next.js repo, you've probably seen my face somewhere. And in the last like 2 years, I was like managing the Nexus team, and then after that, moved back to being an IC, working on mostly TurboPack recently, trying to get that over the line. Very close on development and still working on builds as well. So yeah, that's the very short of it. And yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I think it's really fun because, I just get excited about what everybody else is working on. And so when I see excitement, which I feel like all the excitement these days is, if you look at React, is kind of in the Vercel/Next ecosystem, right? So it's really exciting to see just again all the innovation coming out of there. And I don't know, that's what everybody is talking about. Is there anything else that anybody's talking about? I'm not completely unaware. What do you think, Adam? Anything else? Or is this all we care about these days?
There's lots of other things, but for the context of having Tim on, I think we can start there. I can name lots of other things people are excited about, but let's stick with Tim's wheelhouse and talk about Vercel stuff.
Yeah. So, well, like you said, you've been working on TurboPack a lot, and I know Adam actually has a lot of questions. Adam, why don't you kick us off?
Tell us about how close you are to shipping TurboPack to stable and what it will mean for existing Next.js users. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, sounds good. So I guess like some background for your listeners. The like current Next.js is based on Webpack. It's been based on Webpack since the very start. Very first version of Next.js. Actually, the very first version of Next.js didn't use Webpack, which is also a fun fact. But then after that, we quickly like moved to Webpack, similar to how all like other frameworks from that time. So this is like 2016, right? We're using Webpack, and we ended up like extending it a lot, right? So like we added so Next.js when we first released it was one of the early frameworks that like built on server-side rendering, and like in order to do that, we had to do some like two compilation passes, basically like one for the server, one for the client, get like bundles out, execute those in Node.js, and then render your page, right? That kind of thing. So as the like framework grew, the overall ecosystem started growing as well. It's like the React ecosystem, just overall JavaScript. Like people started pulling in like more and more and more like npm packages, and also just like the npm packages themselves started getting larger and larger and larger. So an example of that is like React icons, which ships like every single icon library you could think of, and all those icon libraries are generally like re-exporting up to like 10,000, 11,000 individual like JavaScript files under them. So today, if you install an npm dependency, it's actually very likely that these like packages that you're installing are actually pulling in a lot more JavaScript than they were like 6 years ago, for example. So what that means is that this like bundler that was built in like over 10 years ago at this point um, was not optimized for that particular case, like processing like tens of thousands of modules. However, like smaller apps are now starting to become like tens of thousands of modules by default because of these like libraries that you're pulling in. It's not per se like your own code, so that's a good thing to know. It's like even if your app is like, oh, I'm writing like 100 lines of code, if you're then like pulling in an icon library, for example, it still ends up being like 10,000 modules that need to be compiled, which is obviously unfortunate and like an ecosystem thing, but also over time, like the overall like the bundler space has evolved quite a bit as well. So we got like faster and faster tools. These were built like more on like native languages, for example, and we started to hit like the limits of like what Webpack can do. So where we started was Webpack felt slow in Next.js, and we optimized that to the maximum of what we could do in the constraints that the bundler has. So an example here is that it's really like it's not impossible, but it's really hard to, for example, introduce parallelism across CPUs in Webpack because it uses JavaScript objects quite heavily. So it's really hard to share memory between like multiple threads, for example. So you can't like you can only use like one CPU at a time, basically. At the same time, the caching heuristics for like disk caching, for example, in Webpack were also just optimized for like writing like smaller apps to disk, basically. But once you have tens of thousands of modules, you would end up like getting caches that are like gigabytes large, basically, that kind of thing. So what we did is we basically set out to solve this like scaling issue that Webpack has, but also acknowledging that in order to grow for like the next 10 years of like larger and larger apps coming up and Next.js growing and Next.js like usage growing as well. So like when we started building Next.js, there was like few small websites that were using it, and they were super happy that they were getting like performance improvement over what they had built themselves. But at this point, we're seeing like some of the largest websites in the world like adopting it, and that also means like hundreds of engineers using these Next.js applications, and more and more code being added, obviously. And because of that, there's basically we had to raise the ceiling of like where things get slow by quite a bit. So like more like 30 to 50,000 modules, but like ideally it wouldn't like matter like how much code you have. Instead, like not redoing work. So for example, like caching more, reusing those caches like more efficiently, and making sure that like when you make a change that we don't have to recalculate, for example, the entire module graph, which is like basically 50,000 like recalculations of like what is this module, does it go there, that kind of thing. The really simple example there is that if we have 50,000 modules and each processing each one takes like 1 millisecond, which might sound fast, it would already be 50 seconds in like single thread, right? So there's like some like physical limit currently on like how large your Webpack app can get. It's not per se a limit on like it won't compile. It's more like a limit on if it feels fast still. So that was like the problem space that we had at the time like we started building TurboPack. I basically set out like building TurboPack to solve all those problems, like get parallelism, get a better efficiency, get better disk caching, and like not redoing work, and most of all, also faster fast refresh and hot module replacement. So if you make a change, seeing the edit on screen as soon as possible. For Webpack, that was like I said, like limited on the graph size. So like if you're importing like 50,000 modules in a single page, you would get a slower HMR than if you imported like one, for example. If you import it one, it's usually fine. If you import it like 1,000, it's usually fine. If you import it 10,000, for example, you would get like a 1 second HMR time, for example, or a fast refresh time. And that was purely in like overhead of processing the module graph. So yeah, so we set out to solve that problem basically. Any questions there so far?
No, that's great. I have a question on something you said. Well, are you done talking about TurboPack?
Sure.
So you mentioned bundler advances and advances in the bundler ecosystem. I'm sure tons and tons of viewers are well familiar with Vite, which is how you pronounce it. It's spelled Vite for, you know that obviously, but
Yeah.
anyone listening, if you've seen Vite, it's really pronounced Vite. Some folks might wonder why you didn't just move Next over to Vite. Did Vite not quite satisfy the constraints or requirements you had? Was it a little too late? Were you already started on TurboPack? Does TurboPack do some things that Vite doesn't quite do that you wanted?
Yeah, definitely. There was I recently read a post, and we can link it in the show notes as well, on like why we like. This is a question that comes up quite a lot, actually. It's obviously like everyone in the ecosystem is using it. Why are you not using it? Why are you building something new? And really, like what we found is that like Vite is great. Like it works super well for the way that people are using it. If you're like if you have a single compiler, for example, and you're just like building like only client-side code, that was like one case, then it's totally fine, right? And then you generally like don't see this limit that we see, which is like people are importing like 50,000 modules, and things get slow still, even in like modern bundlers. So basically, where the place where we started was we want a bundler that's like fast for development, fast for production, and it's mostly the same across like development and production in terms of outputs. So that it uses the same underlying compiler to generate all these outputs. The other is that we didn't want any breaking changes. So like and this is like a very big part of why we had to build TurboPack. The problem that we saw is that um, one bundler is not the other bundler, and insofar like behaviors as well. So this could be like resolving behavior, the way that like plugins interact, the way that just overall like outputs are generated. And what we find is that if we're using another bundler that's not Webpack, doesn't matter what kind of bundler it is, if it was like Parcel or Vite or EaseBuild or anything like that, we would get like such large differences in the way that things work that we would be introducing a break and change just on that, basically. So that meant like you have to somehow refactor your app in like some ways. Obviously, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to make sure that like you as a user of Next.js that already has an app gets like the maximum benefit of like adopting TurboPack or like adopting any new compiler, basically. Like it doesn't matter if it was TurboPack or not. We wanted it to basically be like you upgrade, you start using Dash Turbo, and if you didn't do any Webpack customization, right? Because if you do Webpack customization, obviously like there's not much we can do there. But at that point, like we want to make sure that you get the best experience possible, and you're just like, hey, my app is faster, and it didn't even have to do anything. So that was like one big part. So making sure that you get like at least some level of backwards compat. So we had to implement like all the features that Next.js has, specifically for TurboPack. You might be thinking like, but frameworks, they're not doing that much compilation, that kind of thing. But in reality, it's like I would say like at least 50% of what a modern framework is today is like bundler related, compiler related, outputting code, making sure that's optimized, making sure the code loading is optimized, that kind of thing. And all of that is very particular to the framework, the way that the router works, which also like integrates into that. Um, and it's like in essence, it's like very similar to how, for example, you need like a bundler for React Native, for example. Like I was recently talking to Evan from Expo, and he was like, "Yeah, you're basically like doing the same thing that we're doing." Because you end up like building a bundler, and then the framework is like built around the bundler itself as well, because you need to like optimize the outputs for the framework as well.
You mentioned that a large part of what the bundler is doing is framework features. You said something like that. I'm sorry if I slightly misquoted you. I just to clarify, I think I'm sure people might be wondering about that. You're talking about things like API endpoints, remix loader functions, Next.js, get server-side props functions. Those need to be handled very, very differently than the rest of your React components that are going to run in your client. Those need to be separated out and not ever touch the light of day in your client bundles. You're talking about handling those sorts of things, right?
Not just that. I'm talking about like other features as well. Like say, like Next font is a good example of that. There's like some compilation involved in making Next font work. Like during compilation, it is downloading the metadata for the file for the font itself. And once it downloads that metadata, it can like generate a placeholder font that is like placeholding while the actual font is loading in.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. You can integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. You can leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. You can ship faster with an AI code assistant, and you can work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself.
And that's the type of thing that like is handled in the compiler itself. Another example is like you said, like transforms, like the get server side props transform and the get static props transform. Those strip out get static props, get server side props in the bundle for the client. And then like in like more recent days, like with React Server components, it becomes even more so in bundler story, because we have to like start from the server compiler, find all the client components that you're using. So that's all the files marked with use client, and then create like some optimized like client-side bundle chunking for that. So it's like basically you start on the server, you compile the server code. While you're doing that, you find client components. You need to be compiling those as well, but they're basically like for the browser, right? So a good example of that is like in Webpack. This means like we have to compile all the server code, then do a traversal on the tree to basically find where are the client components, then take those and put them into a separate like Webpack instance that is like a client compiler, so for the browser, and then like inject the entry points there. What we do in TurboPack is we can create like a single like unified module graph where you basically say like these are the server components, these are the client components, and you can just like keep compiling the client components even at the same time as compiling the server code as well. And for that you get like some better parallelism, but also you basically take care of this like coordination problem, because like basically in the current like Webpack based architecture, we have two Webpack compilers that are both watching files, that are both like being triggered by you changing files and like making edits, basically that kind of thing. In TurboPack is all one compiler that is like one watcher that is in charge of like triggering recompiles and that kind of thing, and it can parallelize those like streams of work more. So you basically get like inherently you get a better like more stable compilation by that as well, because you don't get like consistency issues and that kind of thing.
So do you feel like I feel like the entire industry is kind of moving over back to the server, that Yeah, what do you think is gonna change from, like, probably a Vite perspective, or do you think people are gonna start I mean, once TurboPack could be used by others, do you think that's gonna become the next choice?
I think it will highly depend. Like, if you're using Feed today and you're happy with like using Feed today, then everything's fine, right? Like Feed is great. Like it's a really good bundler for if you're like building your own framework, basically, right? In our case, like we want to take it one step further and like make sure that it stays performant over for longer periods of time, and also make sure that it integrates with like the whole like rest of Next.js and the X of that. So I think like overall, like yes, Feed is here to stay, similar to how Webpack is here to stay, right? Like there's tons of people still using Webpack day to day, and in their own frameworks and in the way that they build all of that. The So I don't think like TurboPack would instantly take over every single thing that you would use Feed for example. It's more like if you want to like take into account all these like caching behaviors that we're basically adding, like the additional like disk caching, making sure that everything is the same between like dev and build. But really, like what's interesting to see is that like so we're now a few years in, right? So it's like a few years later, and the V team is also working on something that like closely resembles what TurboPack does, which is called roll down, and that bundler is basically very similar to what we're doing in TurboPack, and that's going to be powering the like next version of Feed, basically. So um, basically,
Isn't
what I'm
roll
seeing
down
is
the
that there's like a lot of cross, like not per se cross collaboration, but it's like there's a lot of like overlap between the things that we're doing.
Yeah.
But they don't like fit like one to one. Like, hey, we can like use Feed in Next.js per se.
isn't roll down the Rust-based rollup port that Evan was working on?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a bit more ambitious now, and they're planning to like use it for mostly to power the Feed builds, because like today Feed builds are based on ease build and like some rollup. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% familiar with this, so don't pay me on this. But basically, what they're planning to do is like replace that part with roll down, and then you'll get the option to also get like similar compilation in development for very large apps. But in essence, like that approach is like very similar to Webpack. Like I was recently talking to Evan at a conference, and we're basically like, yeah, this it's like there's a lot of overlap between the things that we're doing and the overall ecosystem as well. Um, and and it's really cool to see actually, right? Like there's people that tried different things. We tried doing like unbundling, so like not doing bundling in development, and then like loading everything on demand. There's some limits to that, like the amount of like files that you can load, and like when that part gets slow. And that feels very similar to to like the limits that we're hitting with Webpack, for example. So like you see this cycle of like you start building something like in our case like a framework. Framework gets adoption, and the more and more adoption it gets, the larger apps are being built on it. And once they get to a certain point, you just see that like these apps hit some limits that you just didn't see like at the time that you wrote the tool initially, right? That's the case for Webpack. It's the case for Vite at this point. It's the case for um, like we even see that for Next.js, right? Like why we started building AppWriter. Like we started building AppWriter because we saw that people hit limits on what PagesWriter can do, and we wanted to give you better, like a higher ceiling, basically on like what you can do with the framework itself.
Before we move off of bundlers, you got to give us some history here. You said way back when that the initial Next didn't use Webpack. What were you guys using? Like a gulp chain or?
Um, it was something like that. It wasn't Gulp. It was just like custom like transforms on like using Babel basically. So at some point we we're using so the example here is we were using Webpack for bundling client-side code, but for server-side code, we would just run like a Babel transform on every single file, and then output those and then execute those. But the problem came when like people started really figuring out Webpack, and they figured out like I can import CSS now, or I can import like some other like loaders and things like that. And for example, like we contributed to this by like MDX, for example, that kind of thing. So like I can import my MDX file now, and that kind of thing wouldn't work on the server because like we would have to just exclude all of that compilation, and you could never like server-side render that because it would never be compiled in like a Webpack environment, for example. So this is like a long time ago, right? Like 2017, 2018, something like that. So eventually, like I went through the trouble of building this like two compiler architecture where there's like a Webpack instance for the client, Webpack instance for the server. Both of them have their own config, like their own like Webpack config, and they have like different limits, right? But if you add a loader, the loader still works, that kind of thing. So my dream was always to have like just a single like compiler that is like can span the server, client, and now like in recent days it's like server, client, React server components, React client components, server actions, and like server actions can also import like client components and stuff like that as well. So what you have now, and this is like a problem when you're using Webpack, for example, in this like model where there's like two compilers and they have to be like they have to interplay between the two of them. So you're coordinating between like the server is compiling something. Okay, now we're going to the client. The client is compiling something, but now it finds something for the server. So now we have to go back to the server, say like, hey, here's new files. Also compile these, and it's like there's overhead on every single like compile that you trigger on Webpack. So if you do this like chain of like server action imports client component, imports server action, that gets like really slow because it just like has to recompile like 3 or 4 times. So in TurboPack, that's not the case because we can like basically keep like going through this graph and then like later on create all the bundles, for example.
Cool. Thank you so much for that info.
Yeah. That's a lot. I mean, I'm so happy that as a developer, I don't have to deal with any of that and performance is just going to come to me.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
But it's like,
Yeah,
wow, the web is just getting more complicated, but thank God the tooling is trying to keep up.
it's definitely yeah, it's good to see that. So like I said, like everything that we just talked about, this is not something that you know about per se. It's something that you can know about, obviously, if you take a look into like how these compilers work. But in your day to day, you're not like, oh, the server compiler is crashing or something like that. It's more like,
Yeah.
oh, there's like I have an error in this part of my code, and all of this is like just taken care of for you. And that's the case in all frameworks at this point, and that's also good to see because like back when we first released Next.js, that wasn't the case, right? Like it was really hard to build a JavaScript framework that just had like even like moderately good DX because you had to like even in Next.js like we're overriding like Webpack internal errors to give you a better experience, basically that kind of thing. So yeah, that's definitely yeah, good to see that the ecosystem is evolving as the apps that we're building get larger as well.
Yeah. Well, we have to talk about some of the stuff that I think people are excited about, or okay, I don't know, excited or complaining on Twitter about.
Yeah, I
So,
can set this up.
yeah, of course, go ahead.
We have a few minutes left, and I want to set you up well here. Lots of people are angry about the way Next caching works. You guys monkey patched fetch, and it caches things aggressively by default, and that's doubly bad because there are libraries that you can import that use fetch under the covers, and so Next hijacks those fetch calls and aggressively caches things that are outside of the developer's control. Can you give us any info that might make those developers a little bit happier for the future?
Yeah, so if you've seen the recent like Next.js 15 release candidate announcement, so the first happy update there is that we're no longer doing any of the fetch caching. That was like caching by default, that kind of thing. The main thing to know here is that like we never fetch in the browser, which is the standard fetch, but we only like override the one in Node, which actually makes it behave more like the browser, because the browser by default actually caches. But besides that, the default now is to not do any caching, and if you add like cache force cache or anything like that, it can still do the caching for you if you want to, but it doesn't do it by default. So you no longer have to think about it. On top of that, we're also changing the default for like route handlers. So route handlers would also be statically generated by default if you just have a get handler. People find this really confusing because they were like they were used to like Pages API, basically Pages routers, like API routes were all dynamic by default. So in Next.js 15, these will all be also dynamic, but you can still opt into it being statically generated at build time. And that's useful for example, if you want to generate like some OG images or anything like that at build time instead of at runtime. And so you can still use the same like feature that you had before. And on top of that, also there was like client-side router caching. So like if you click around, you navigate around, you would get like a 30-second like a limit between like before it starts refetching the data. So that has been changed to 0 basically, which means that if you click around, you see the like data update immediately. The one thing that wasn't removed is that it like fetches below the common layout, but that is actually like more like any other framework that you're using that as nested routing, because it just doesn't refetch the like layouts themselves, because otherwise it would like basically have to fetch from the HTML down, and now it fetches from the like common layout down.
I cut you off a little, Tracy. Go ahead.
No, you
Please.
didn't cut me off. It's fine. No, I just it's I know there's a lot of discourse around, app router, pages router, what's happening, what's this, what's that, and it's kind of good to hear kind of some of the things that are coming down the pipeline. And
The
it's
future is bright.
exciting. Yeah. Yeah. The future is bright. Yeah. And Tim, I'm sure you find it quite annoying that now you have a lot of users and now things just take longer because all of a sudden, you can't just ship breaking changes and there's so many considerations to now take into consideration.
You can never break Pages directory. That's in stone.
It's definitely like as you get more usage, people will find every single edge case that you could
Yes.
think of, which is both fun to see and also makes things really hard, because at some point you realize like, oh, there's people like importing like Next.js internals to make changes to them at runtime, for example. But also I don't find it annoying that there's more usage. It's obviously like really good to see that there is like a like the large adoption doesn't come from nowhere. Obviously, like
Yes. Yes.
there's a lot of people that are relying on it day to day to both build like their personal websites and like I don't know, like things that you want to build online yourself, but also like mission critical like websites that people use every day. Like yesterday, I had to sign something where like my identity had to be like double confirmed, and I looked at the like webalizer, and it was like a Next.js website, which is really interesting to see. So you see like governments adopting it, large businesses, e-commerce, some of the largest websites, I'm usually like very surprised by how often this happens. So like sometimes I just like clicking on like what is this website on, and I'm like, oh, it's Next.js, very interesting. And like what's also interesting there is that there's so much like it's not interesting actually. It's just like there's so much people self-hosting and like putting it out online by themselves as well. There's a lot of companies that we just like don't hear about, and then like suddenly they're like, here's like very well-known brand name on Next.js, like outside of like hosting on Vercel or anything like that. Because there's like this common misconception that like if you use Next.js, you have to go with Vercel, but in reality, it's like a very large amount of usage is actually not on Vercel, which is totally fine, and like we're fully supporting that as well. And these are still very successful websites. They're like some of the very like large names that you know about, and it's definitely like over the last like few months we're seeing the like wave of like app writer applications as well coming online now. Obviously there's like people that either like moved from Pages Writer to App Writer, but there's also like a lot of like new websites being built on top of App Writer for some of the like larger names in the brands as well.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
would
I know we
say
recently helped Chipotle, who's using Next and Vercel. So that was fun project, and it's cool to see Chipotle, some of their campaigns be using it. So that's really fun. And yeah, it's
no,
What
sorry,
is
go
definitely
ahead.
exciting to me is that the apps that are coming out of App Writer are actually like in many cases a lot better than what we saw for Pages Writer by default. So they end up like shipping like slightly less JavaScript, and their overall like experience is just better, basically. Faster iteration, more interactive, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I'd like to plus one what you said. You don't need Vercel to use Next.js. I don't want to say too much, but I have direct production experience with a very large worldwide web application that's Next.js, and we self-host it with Kubernetes and Docker, and that works beautifully. You can't really use caching. You can't rely on caching too much because you might hit different pods, and they will each have their own cache since it's persistent in memory. But other than that, it's great. And of course, we have our own caching. You can use Redis or some other version of caching. So you absolutely are not stuck with Vercel if you happen to like Next and don't like Vercel. But
Hmm.
Vercel hosting is awesome anyway, so you shouldn't hate
I
it.
mean, I really, really, really love how magical and easy it is if you're using Next to use Vercel, and just the experience, the developer experience to just it's just so nice and it
Dude,
feels
it's
so
insane.
good.
Like my
I
blog
know.
is on Vercel, and I can just like create a branch and I push, and then it
Yeah.
gives me a snapshot on that branch, on that commit, and I can just send it to someone to read a draft. It's perfect.
It's definitely like it raised the bar on like what hosting looks like. It did that for me like so I joined the company in 2017, end of 2017. And the company I worked at before was an agency like building like e-commerce websites for like pretty big names in the Netherlands. And a lot of their like trouble was really like getting like staging environments and like quickly like showing customers like this is the change that I have. And that was always like something that really attracted me in like the preview deployments model. And then later on it was just like improved so much as like Vercel grew as well. So you have like preview comments that like allow like say your customers to like post some like comment bubble on the page itself, and it was like definitely something that we were looking at like looking for at the time. We really like this is another like segue into TurboPack. The thing that I like to see is like we get to a point where you can cache so much of the like compilation that like most of what you did was already cached before. And then when you push up a change, there's just like changing the color of a button or changing some of the styling of like one page. We don't have to go and like recompile all the pages in order to actually like show that new change. And that should get us to like somewhere in the region of that like magical feeling that at least I had when I like did FTP deployments, where you can just like drag up a file and you see the changes. Um, Obviously, we're not there yet, but I'd love to get at that point because at that point, you're just like more likely to also like quickly show something to your like colleagues or someone that you're working with, um, and it's just like it will make a better experience overall for like all the deployment itself. And one of the cool things here is that like I said, all the things that we're working on are not Vercel specific. So all of the improvements that we're building in TurboPack are all like just part of Next.js, and everyone that is using Next.js is going to get those benefits in the long term.
Well,
FTP
awesome.
deployments, the good old days of web development.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. Is there anything else we missed that you wanted to share?
I don't think so. Would definitely recommend looking at the Nexus 15 release candidate. There's a bunch of changes there. Like I said, it's a release candidate, so it's not unstable yet, but you can try it out today already. It has all the caching changes that I talked about. It has TurboPack. You can use that with Dashes Turbo for development. It has like hydration diffs, which is a huge DX win. I've been asking the React team for a long time for that type of feature.
Oh my God,
Um,
that's huge. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That people have been
Sure,
begging
yeah.
for that for years. That's
Yes.
really cool.
So we went ahead and actually like shipped that. So pretty much everyone that has used React before, at least in like a server environment, has seen like one of those errors before, where like you nest your like p tags and that's not valid HTML, so like it gets thrown away. And then like React doesn't know how to hydrate it, and then the error that you get is like hydration failed because p tag, basically that kind of thing. And it was just like really hard for people to understand like where is this thing actually coming from. And at this point, we now have like a diff view of that, which basically showed you exactly the line that was changing. And one of those examples is like if you do a new date and you just render that and you hydrate it on the client, the date is now different, obviously. But that now is highlighted as well. So there's like a diff view that just says like plus, minus, and then like this is a change. So far the feedback on that has been really good. If you still have like cases that you like to see improved, reach out to us. But it's definitely like that is a really big DX improvement, because we just saw that like that's a pain that everyone has every day. But it was also something that in like the time I was working on Next.js, I just couldn't solve by myself, right? Like we had to get like deeper integration into React in order to do that. Like React had to give us all that info. And now we're actually able to do it by contributing to React itself, for example. Yeah, and then on top of that, the other like nice to have thing that if you use Next.js quite often, it might be good to know. There's now a create next app dash empty, which is like same template, but no like the actual like template itself is not there, like the page itself. So it's just like an empty like app writer folder or pages writer folder,
I've been
which is
wanting
really
that too.
nice.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Cool. Well, definitely check out Tim on Twitter or on GitHub. I guess that's where he hangs out the most. So thank you again, Tim, for joining us. And yeah, I hope this really inspires people also to just get excited about working on building technologies in open source, because it's fun and complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
Which
Thanks for
makes
having
life
me.
way more interesting, right? Like, I mean, we all get bored. So we want those breaking changes, Tim. So we have something to do. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we're trying to not make any like like large breaking changes. The main thing about AppWriter was also to have like a cutoff point of
Mhm.
like AppWriter and PagesWriter are completely different in the way that like some features are just like left behind in PagesWriter, and mainly because those like didn't fit well with React Server components or with some of these other features. Like one of the examples there is like AMP support, like AMP HTML. Like you can still use it in PagesWriter, but it doesn't really work in the model of like streaming rendering in AppWriter. So that was like one of the examples that is like it's going to stay around in PagesWriter, but in AppWriter, like it's really hard to get to that point where it actually works. And also, there's like not that many people using it. So it's definitely like we're trying to minimize the amount of breaking changes, but like if there's a lot of feedback on like, for example, the caching is a really good example. Like we're making a breaking change there because people have asked us to make that breaking change so that get a better experience day to day.
Well, amazing. Thanks everyone for listening again. And definitely check out Adam and Tim on Twitter, myself as well. And we'll see you all next time.